War has existed for about as long as humans have walked the earth, and the longer we've been around, we've gotten better at offing each other. That all adds up to really bad news. Here are the deadliest battles in the history of the world. The Battle of Normandy is one of the most famous military operations of all time. In just over a month, the armies of the Allies landed in northern France, established a beachhead, and eventually captured and dominated the region of Normandy. It was the basis for the liberation of Western Europe. Freedom for France, however, came at a price. All in all, Operation Overlord took about 500,000 lives as the cost for a foothold in France. Considering the importance of the campaign and the extraordinarily high death tolls endured during other significant battles in the same war, that figure still seems like something of a lucky break for the Allies. This battle began when German General Erich von Falkenhayn decided that in order to cripple Britain's war machine, the French army had to be defeated. To achieve this goal, he would make a focused attack at one point on the French lines. He wanted to bleed the Allies into submission. The decision was taken to launch this attack on the fortresses surrounding the Verdun region in northeastern France. On February 21, 1916, the German army launched its first attack on the French lines. Early German successes inevitably turned into a stalemate between the two sides, and by the end of the year, the French had managed to retake much of their lost territory. This was in part due to a diversionary attack launched by the British at the Somme. Over the 10-month span of the Battle of Verdun, the two sides combined for some 300,000 dead and some 400,000 wounded. In 1916, the British Army spearheaded a major offensive along the River Somme in an attempt to pull German forces away from their assault on Verdun. Commanding the attack was Sir Douglas Haig. The battle began with an Allied bombardment of the German lines that lasted 7 days. Over 100,000 men then climbed over the top of their trenches and advanced toward the enemy. The Germans, who had taken minimal losses under artillery fire, held their positions, armed with machine guns and rifles. More than 19,200 British soldiers died on the first day alone. Haig pressed the attack. Substantial gains achieved during the battle were soon negated by poor weather. By the end of the 141-day battle, the British had advanced only 7 miles. The British suffered around 420,000 casualties, the French lost about 200,000, and the Germans lost somewhere around 450,000. In total, there were well over 1 million casualties during the battle. By 1938, things weren't looking good for the Chinese army. The Empire of Japan had invaded China the year before, making stunning tactical gains and inflicting a slew of atrocities against Chinese POWs and civilians alike. To finish off the war quickly, the Japanese intended to strike the city of Zhengzhou. To do that, however, they had to cross the Yellow River. The Chinese army managed to slow down the invaders by destroying a railway bridge near Zhengzhou itself, but its leaders were well aware that their position was untenable. In the end, they decided to commit the unthinkable and break the dikes of the Yellow River in a desperate attempt to halt the Japanese advance. To keep the move a surprise, the civilian populace was given little warning. On June 9th, the dikes were broken, and the waters of the Yellow River flooded into the surrounding region. The Japanese were stopped in their tracks, allowing the Chinese government to relocate its capital to Chongqing and put off the end of the war by several months. The region, largely made up of farms and tilled land, was almost entirely flooded. Countless villages were destroyed, 800,000 people were killed, and nearly 4 million were displaced. The Battle of Stalingrad is one of the most notorious sieges of all time. For almost 7 months, an army of beleaguered and battered Russian defenders held out against the full force of the Third Reich. It was arguably the most important battle of the entire war. Adolf Hitler's plan in 1942 was to use Stalingrad as a stepping stone from which to take Moscow and complete his invasion of Russia. Stalin, in response, issued Order No. 227, declaring that the defenders of Stalingrad would take, quote, not one step back, and his refusal to evacuate the city's civilians was used as an incentive for his soldiers to fight harder.
It is either victory or death! Those who retreat
I need a rifle.
will be shot!
I need a rifle.
There will be no mercy!
By September 1942, the Germans had almost captured the entire city, and the Soviets were forced into fighting house to house in some of the most intense and vicious combat of the war. A surprise offensive by the Soviets in November soon turned the battle in their favor. The onset of winter proved damaging to the German forces, as did Hitler's refusal to order a retreat from the river Volga. Soon the city's attackers were beaten back and surrounded. roughly 91,000 German troops finally surrendered to the Soviets on February 2nd. It's difficult to know just how many died as a result of the Battle of Stalingrad, but the Axis are believed to have lost over 800,000 men. The Soviets suffered 1.1 million casualties, as well as another 40,000 civilians on top of that. The 100 Days Offensive was a major operation on the Western Front of World War I, which sought to deprive the German forces of the gains they'd acquired in 1918's Spring Offensive. On September 26, 1918, American troops launched an attack in the Meuse-Argonne region, followed the next day by a British attack toward Cambrai, and an offensive deep in Flanders the day after that. On September 29th, the main assault would take place, a British and French attack on the Hindenburg Line. The offensive was a major success. German reserves and resources were stretched across the entire front, and the Supreme Command was woefully unprepared to defend against the rapid nature of the Allied attacks. By the evening of September 28th, the German Quartermaster General Erich von Ludendorff had informed his superior Paul von Hindenburg that Germany must sue for peace or risk annihilation. The armistice was signed on November 11th. Allied casualties during the 100 Days Offensive amounted to around 700,000. The Germans lost somewhere around 760,000. The German siege of Leningrad lasted a staggering 827 days, from September 1941 to January 1944. The city was of critical symbolic, tactical, and industrial importance to each side. It drew a massive joint German-Finnish offensive force. The Soviets set up a sea of defenses and barricades as well. The Germans soon found themselves unable to take Leningrad by sheer force, and instead chose to starve the city out via a protracted siege. Despite some successful attempts to evacuate the civilian population, many remained inside the city. Starvation became widespread within the Soviet defenses, and a few may have resorted to cannibalism to survive. Relief didn't arrive until 1944, with the beginning of the Leningrad-Novgorod strategic offensive. The incoming Soviet forces overwhelmed the Germans and drove them away from the city. Over 1 million Soviet troops were killed or captured during the battle, and almost 2.5 million were wounded. The total number of civilian deaths may be anywhere between 670,000 and 1.5 million. The Germans lost nearly 580,000 men. The Battle of Leningrad was by far the costliest engagement in human history. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about the history of war are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.